Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association. We are honored today to have with us Michael Listner. Michael, you've been involved in the space domain now for a while. Could you just provide a brief background of your career and what led you to be so prominent in the space legal domain?
Well, again, thank you for having me, Bill. I really look forward to actually participating in this venue. Space Force Association definitely has a lot of credible names behind it, supporting it, and I think it's a very worthy organization to support the men and women who are the new warfighters in the Space Force, the new branch of the military, the Space Force. So a little bit about me. My name is Michael Listner. I am an attorney licensed here, both in state and federal court in the state of New Hampshire. How did I get started is a long story, so I'll try and keep it really short for the sake of our audience. But space has always been something that I've been interested in since I was a child. I thought during grade school and high school I was going to be an astronaut, and what most of us think we're going to be astronauts or a pilot or something like that. But fate takes a different direction, and I ended up becoming an attorney. And I really forgot about space a lot during my time as an attorney until my third year of law school, where I had to write a paper for international law. And my question was, what am I going to write about for international law? Because this paper is going to be like 90% of my grade. And I thought about outer space. I said, I wonder what the laws of what kind of law there is for outer space. And I started doing research, and I found out there's actually quite a bit out there. So I wrote my first paper. I wrote that paper for the instructor actually recommended for publication. So I was published in a law journal as a law student. And from there, I kind of, after I graduated, I have to kind of, step away from space a little bit because I had to think about passing the bar, which is another and really focused endeavor that you have to put all your period, and just doing a lot of thinking, because I really don't like to come right out and start blurting things out without thinking about it. So in about 2009, 2000, that area, I started really writing about it with a lot of online publications, and I actually started recognized for some of my writings. I became very prominent on some online internet shows, and somehow I became an authority in this area of space law. And I started a company back in 2011 called Space Law and Policy Solutions, which is still going today. And that's basically a consultation firm, kind of a consultation firm, kind of a think tank firm that basically advises everybody from commercial entities, even to government, if they ask me to come in and actually consult on matters of outer space law and policy. And I've really enjoyed this area. It's been everything you love is going to aggravate you at one point in time. And sure enough, this endeavor has aggravated me more than once. But I've learned a lot about it on my own. And actually, it's really interesting because this is a very, very new area of law. It's exciting, and it's kind of a sense of responsibility going into this, because you're actually helping to develop this field of law.
Yeah, I tell you, one of the biggest things that people are talking about right now is the reference to the space domain as the Wild Wild West. What could you draw on some of the comparisons between, obviously we're not going to talk about the Wild Wild West, but is working in the space domain, deploying capabilities into the space domain, norms of behavior in the space domain, is it the Wild Wild West, or is it going to be the Wild West if we're not careful about the production of the policies and norms of behavior that we know we need?
Well, I think when we get a lot of references to Wild Wild West, people initially think of lawlessness. So basically each town comes in and it is law by the gun. And that really isn't the case, because there is a lot of foundational law in the international arena. But now that space is becoming more of, more prolific in terms of activities, it's become more domestic. We had, for example, in the United States here, we have a lot of domestic laws that relate to outer space. And in fact, other countries have domestic laws that relate to outer space. So in a sense, it really isn't the Wild Wild West in the sense of lawlessness, but it is a new area and we're kind of building on it. And this whole idea of, well, what are the rules going to be? And I've always said, well, you know what, it's easy. We can sit down at a table and decide what the rules are going to be without knowing what the future of space is going to look like. Or we can actually participate in these activities and make up and create the rules as we need them based on our experience out there, or what we call customary international law in my terms.
And when you say customary international law, and I know there's plenty of discussion about going on about the maritime domain and the relationship between what the rules of the sea are and how you can compare that and maybe project that into the space domain. Can you talk a little bit about that and if there is a relationship opportunity there?
Well, maritime law is very attractive for people who want to develop rules in outer space or develop the law or jurisprudence of outer space, because, well, we figure, it's kind of akin to, people just are naturally drawn to it. And there are some similarities, but it's really not a one-to-one comparison. I think if you want to get right down to it, the closest comparison, terrestrial comparison to outer space, is Antarctica. And if there was this thing back in 1959 called the Antarctic Treaty, the U.S. was one of the original creators of that treaty. If you lay that down beside the foundational doctrine for outer space, which is the Outer Space Treaty, you'd see they're almost identical in terms of what they say and what they do. So really, space isn't really analogous to maritime law, but more to Antarctica. And this kind of gets into things that I talk about with people. They ask, when they bring up the maritime law issue, it's like, no, maritime law doesn't have anything to do with it. Any terrestrial law doesn't have anything to do with outer space. It's got to be treated on its own. We got to forget about terrestrial based laws and focus on space, because it is such a unique domain. And well, I mean, it just, given the fact that space isn't terrestrial, we got to really divorce ourselves from the idea that we can, grab onto ideas or laws that we created on Earth to try and apply it to outer space.
And so when you start talking about that, and the way I think about this is, we set up exclusion zones in the air domain all the time. And if that exclusion zone is not adhered to, there are very swift repercussions for those activities. I mean, you are held accountable to ensure that you abide by those exclusion zones. I mean, we do that in the air domain, we do that in the land domain, we do that in the maritime domain. I mean, is that something that we can adopt for the space domain? I mean, and how do you hold that person accountable if they break through those?
Yeah, the idea of exclusion zones, or another term they would call it, or what we call safety zones, or what I call buffer zones. On the one hand, I talk about you can't really compare maritime law to outer space law, but I do it all the time. So I'm just as guilty as everybody else who goes out and compares it. One of the things I really thought of early on in my space law career was this idea about protecting, having areas of exclusion around satellites in particular. And what I based this on was carrier battle groups. So carrier battle group basically has a designated zone around it. I'm not sure of the exact distance or exact rules that we say, okay, if an aircraft or a ship approaches within a certain amount, within this zone that we have set up, this artificial zone, which is actually a moving zone, we will alert aircraft, we'll tell them, please get out of here. The idea, one of my ideas, which caught a lot of flack to begin with, was the idea of setting up these types of zones around satellites, because in a sense, satellites are moving around the Earth, and almost what I was calling was these little zones of sovereignty in outer space, and that's basically what a carrier battle group does. It has these little zones of sovereignty that extends amongst itself as the group is moving through what is otherwise international waters. Extremely controversial, because the whole idea is space doesn't belong to anybody. You can't put any. You can't plant a flag. You can't say this is mine. You can't come in. So fundamentally, this is something that was meant when I originally proposed it, gained a lot of basically a lot of blowback. But nowadays, I've been hearing a lot more talk about this, especially when we're talking about this idea of satellite servicing. Basically the idea is, we got establishing these zones around the activity itself. I think actually this very interesting, and I think it's actually been addressed in the sense by the U.S. military. Last year, a Russian inspector satellite got kind of cozy near one of our photo reconnaissance satellites, and we made it very clear to the Russian Federation this was unacceptable. Now, there's no written rule in space law that basically says you cannot move near a satellite like that, or that you cannot. In other words, basically what the idea was, the Russians, in my opinion, were testing us to see what they could get away with. So believe it was General Raymond who made a very public statement about it, and I'm sure our diplomatic agency has also made it loud and clear, this isn't acceptable. So this kind of transfers in the idea of norms and customary international law. Fundamentally, what the Russians, I believe, were trying to do was create a norm of how close could you get to it. But by pushing back on it, by these very vocal disagreements about this activity, we basically told the Russians, no, this isn't going to be acceptable. We're not going to accept this as a norm or customary international law. So please don't do it again. So the whole idea of customary international law, we could talk hours for it. I could talk hours for it about it, but we won't, obviously, because of time constraints. The idea is of creating these rules through activities versus sitting down at a table and deciding, well, this is the way things should work, even though we haven't done it before. And that's where space as a new domain is really, really critical, especially when you have, for national security missions, especially. We got to basically decide the more these missions increase, the more we got to develop these ideas, the more we learn by actually performing these activities. And the same goes for commercial space as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to identify and talk about for the audience the difference between national security space, what needs to be provided by the DoD, and what capabilities are augmented to the DoD by civilian, commercial space capabilities. And that's going to be pretty important because obviously, again, we got to draw these analogies because, we haven't experienced that yet. So we got to live through those experiences. Right. We haven't had to fight a world war based in the space domain. Thank goodness. And I don't think anybody wants to. If the war extends into space, or when the war extends into space, we have to then start to have these types of discussions. But to again draw the analogy between the air domain, you've got an airline that is shot down. That's a huge issue. So what are the analogies that we can draw to the space domain if one of our satellites is shot down or taken out or disrupted or degraded?
Well, that's and again, I guess that gets to the point where these satellites are operating under the principle of free access. And ironically, it was our Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union, who basically blessed us with the idea of free access through outer space with Sputnik 1. Prior to Sputnik 1, the Eisenhower administration basically wanted this idea of reconnaissance satellites, and also using space for scientific purposes, but mostly for reconnaissance satellites to actually see what the Soviet Union was doing. And they wanted to establish the idea of free access, but they didn't know how to do it. Now, up to that time, the Soviet Union basically says we own from the ground all the way up to outer space above us. In other words, they were saying we're nationalizing the outer space above us. When they launched Sputnik, that kind of put them in a bad situation because Sputnik was basically traversing over the territory of other nations. So in effect, under their theory, they were violating the sovereign territory of other nations. But nobody said anything about it. And basically, the Eisenhower administration was very gleeful in the fact that, hey, they just did us a huge favor in establishing this idea of free access to outer space. So the idea is, since that principle has been established in customary international law and actually codified in the Outer Space Treaty, that has been going on that's been going on for a long time. So if, say, there was a war and one of our adversaries, say the PRC or the Russian Federation, decided to use a counter space weapon from, say, the ground or even co-orbital, and interfered, and I'll use the nice term, interfered with one of our space assets. Fundamentally, under the idea of free access, they would be interfering with our rights and violating international law. Now, this is where things get tricky because we have this concept called lawfare. In other words, using law as a weapon of war. And that's another big subject that unfortunately I don't have enough time in this video to talk about. But in the case of the People's Republic of China, right now, their scholars are working on trying to promote the idea that the China owns all the space from the ground all the way up to space. In other words, they're nationalizing space or suggesting that they can nationalize space all the way up to outer space, just like the Soviet Union did. What's the reason? Because that would give them a legal justification to actually, quote, interfere with our assets that, quote, pass over their sovereign territory. So I think that's a roundabout way of answering your question, but showing you some of the loopholes that other nations are trying to work around with it. I mean, the whole idea of, using ASATs is obviously one of those things that, people don't want to see happen. But unfortunately, when you see nations that are developing legal justifications like this to do so, it increases the chances that it might.
And from a accountability standpoint, I mean, now we've got a PRC rocket body that's basically tumbling in orbit. So what are the rules and norms that responsible spacefaring nations need to comply with to ensure access to space? And how do you prevent activities like that from happening? And what if, we have to play the what if game a little bit, what if that rocket body comes back down and rains debris and, God forbid, injures somebody? Not saying that would happen, but it could happen. And or takes out infrastructure, or it just what are the responsible activities in space to ensure that we have continued access to that domain? Well,
a lot of this idea comes down to liability. What is liability of a nation that does this? And back in 1972, there was a document signed called the Liability Convention, which basically, puts on these states that launch these objects in orbit the idea that you're responsible for what happens to them if they cause damage on the surface of the Earth or in outer space. And it actually has two different scenarios and two different standards of culpability. The first one is what we call in Article 2 is basically a strict liability standard. And that happens when if an object from another state falls from orbit and hits the surface of another state and causes damage, or even on its way down hits an airplane belonging to another state. In that case, the state is called, the standard applied is called strict liability, which means basically, we're not going to be, mitigating any of your culpability. You're strictly liable. That's it for any damages called. Now, this was actually invoked once back in 1979 with Cosmos 954, which was a nuclear-powered Warsat that malfunctioned in orbit and crashed in the Canadian Northwest. There was a big dust-up about that. The Canadian government and the Soviet Union basically went back and forth about this. Had to get the Soviet Union to become accountable for it. In other words, admit that this was actually their spacecraft, and then make them, and then actually get compensation financially from them as well. But all of that was invoked under that idea of the Liability Convention. The same standard applies to that rocket body. I know I look up a little bit too, because that rocket body basically is flying over me too. So, and if it's a little bit short, it might just land in my lap. But yeah, the same standard applies. If that rocket body was to come down and cause damage, the U.S. government could call the Chinese embassy right in Washington and say, we got a problem, and this is your rocket body. You're still responsible for it, even though it's a twisted, burning wreck, and it caused damage. So we want you to pay up, and that's where politics comes in. First you got to get them to admit. And I think the best analogy is if you're driving, you get in an accident. What your insurance carrier basically says, first thing is don't admit liability. And that's exactly what happens in situations like this. And the Cosmos 954 incident, that's what happened. The Soviet Union initially would not admit liability. And eventually the Canadian government wore them down enough and convinced them that, hey, this is yours, and they acquiesced. But it took a lot of political back and forth. I think something similar might happen with the Chinese rocket if that were to, God forbid, actually impact any territory here in the U.S. But understand the idea of culpability and accountability is in there, but the matter of enforceability is more related to how much political pressure you can put on a state versus what you can do to them legally.
Okay, thank you for that. No, that does clarify it quite a bit. And now we're talking about the the satellites and how they're sovereign to the respective country that launched them, or even the country that owns the satellite itself. However, Jared Isaacman in Inspiration 4 has just bought, access to space later on this year, and he and three other civilians are going to be launched into orbit and be orbiting the Earth, several times. The question becomes, what happens if something is, something gets in their way, or they're quote unquote attacked or disrupted, or their mission is disrupted? What is the responsibility of the United States to either, one, rescue the civilians, or two, provide some kind of protection to the civilians? Or, how would that work? Because now we're going to start having probably quite a bit of human spaceflight. So we have to start talking about protection for those humans in space.
Yeah, and that's a good question. Fundamentally, the bottom line is any object, whether it's a whether it's a spacecraft or a soda bottle within that spacecraft that's launched into orbit, basically operates under the jurisdiction of the state that launched it. So we're going to use the United States just as the example, so we don't get too confusing here. So if I launch a rocket, when the capsule and the people that go into it remain under the jurisdiction of the United States, and that's under treaty law, under the Outer Space Treaty that I discussed. Now, wherever they travel in space, they're always U.S. citizens. It's always U.S. territory. It's always U.S. jurisdiction. And I'm going to jump to my maritime example, even though I hate comparing space to maritime law. There's a law, a customary international law, that basically a federal warship, a wreck of a federal warship or an aircraft remains the property of the state that launched it, even unless it's expressly abandoned. So if I go, say, for a good example, it probably is the Bismarck. The Bismarck is sitting in over several miles of ocean at the bottom, but that is still a federal warship. So I can't, if I have a submersible, I can't go down there and start plucking pieces off from it, because that still belongs to the Federal Republic of Germany, unless they say otherwise. So that same idea kind of applies to space objects. To continually, as long as that space object goes, continues in outer space, even if it's abandoned, or I'm not going to use that word abandoned, even if it's no longer functioning, it still belongs to the United States, and the United States is still responsible for any damage. And it's also responsible for the actions of its personnel. Now, when we get into private citizens actually performing space activities in, quote, private spacecraft, we know there's a little bit of a twist. Part of the Outer Space Treaty that was negotiated, much to the Soviet Union's chagrin, was the idea of private individuals, non-governmentals we call them, actually participating in space activities. And the Soviet Union didn't want it. They just wanted space to be the domain of government. But eventually, we negotiated with them, and we got them to agree that civilians or non-governmentals can perform space activities. But the caveat that the Soviets insisted on was that they had to be authorized and continually supervised. And those words have caused much consternation, and still cause much consternation, and just are the nightmare of private space operators, because they're very vague and they're very fluid as to what they can actually mean. So the whole idea is the U.S. is continually responsible for their activity. So, for example, if you have a spacecraft, a private spacecraft that goes up there and starts raising havoc with, in some way, or creates a problem up there, it isn't the citizens that are going to be in trouble. The first place that the country who is affected by it is they're going to get on the phone to the U.S. Embassy and start saying, "Hey, there's a problem here. With your people are up there causing problems. We don't care about legal liability for them. You're under the law. You're legally liable." So that's a clincher. The U.S. is always on the hook for it. Now, the U.S. has, governments have ways of basically mitigating those problems. For example, if a private spacecraft, basically fell out of orbit and caused damage in another country, back to the liability convention, the U.S. would be on the hook, and if they had to pay out money, they said, "Okay, we paid this out. Now we want you to indemnify us, or compensate us for the money we had to pay for your activities." So the whole idea, again, this gets back to the idea of space being the wild, wild west. It's not, because like I tell people, you can try and launch a rocket from orbit from your backyard without the government's authorization, but the government will be there pretty quickly to tell you that you can't, just because of those laws. So the idea of the space being lawless in the sense of what private individuals can do is really nonsensical, in my opinion, and basically dreamlike in most respects, because those rules that we agreed to in like the Outer Space Treaty and general international law say differently. So in other words, we don't have all the laws in the books because we haven't done all the activities yet, but we have a good solid foundation to actually build a framework for new rules and new norms as activities become more prolific.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, obviously, if that spacecraft, the Inspiration 4 spacecraft, does something to hinder or interfere with other countries' orbits, obviously that's an issue. The accountability aspect of, what if there's an object that is put up there by we won't say adversarial country, but another country that interferes with the path of the spacecraft, that kind of leads into space traffic management and the issues associated with that. How are countries going to be held accountable for their own, space traffic management? And then I would say space object mitigation is probably the safest way to say that without saying, clean up the trash in orbit. But, that's really what it comes down to. How are countries going to be held accountable to clean up that trash?
Well, again, I think it's going to be more political than anything else, because the nuance of international law is it doesn't really have a lot of teeth. There's really the enforcement mechanism really isn't there for it. So the idea is, if a norm or a rule of international law is broken, well, first you're going to plead not guilty, point, and then show how you didn't violate it. And we're talking political realism here, but ultimately, basically it could be political blowback, political embarrassment on the world stage, less confidence from your allies, and more political fodder for your adversaries to beat on you. So this whole idea of space debris, space traffic management, this is all important, and it's something that's actually been discussed a lot at the United Nations right now. There's this idea of these guidelines for sustainable use of outer space that were actually agreed to, I think it was back in 2019, I believe, is when they were agreed to. Now, these are all when we say sustainability, these are all very vague ideas or vague pronouncements, and they still have yet to sit down and flesh them out. And that's the idea behind, I really want to emphasize with international law, especially like with the Outer Space Treaty. It's very fluid. It's very open on how it can be interpreted. I mean, I think there's only one really solid prohibition in the Outer Space Treaty, and that's no nuclear weapons in outer space. But aside from that, it's pretty fluid and open into interpretation, which gives us the ideas of this idea of space resources or space mining, what have you. So to answer your question, how are we going to be held accountable? Your accountability is going to rest in the realm of politics, and what kind of punitive measures could be taken, both in the international system, political blowback, propaganda, etc.
Can you talk a little bit about the information that's been provided by elected officials, and really the policy of? Have you been tracking the different policies towards international relations with regard to the space domain, and what could the current administration use as a baseline to start to describe what those norms of behavior should be and could be, and then what happens if? What would be the mechanism to get that information out?
Well, I think there's been a lot of talk about during the last administration, the 45th administration of the Artemis Accords, and fundamentally, basically, this is an idea of basically a framework built on the current foundation of international law for how we're going to perform things on other celestial bodies like the moon, comets, asteroids, other planets. It's basically a very rough outline, a rough framework that they want to build upon, and by having other nations sign on to this, I believe there's eight nations that have actually signed on to the Artemis Accords. We're getting them to agree to, okay, this is how we're going to facilitate our future activities and our future discussions. In other words, if we need to, if activities start coming up and we have questions about what the rules should be, we'll come back, we'll sit down, we'll talk about it, and we'll build more on this framework. But we'll build on the framework as need be, versus just sitting down and saying, you know what, this is the way I think they should do it, and go from there. Now, that was basically the approach of the Trump administration, was to actually go, and the Artemis Accords were basically outside of the UN. They kind of sidestepped the UN system. As far as the Biden administration, I'm unsure how they're going to communicate that. I mean, there was a national security memorandum released by the White House, I believe, back in January, kind of a preliminary memorandum that basically, in my opinion, said we want to go back into the UN system to actually start facilitating the ideas of the use of outer space versus what the Trump administration was doing. So how's that going to develop into norms? I don't know. I mean, there's been a suggestion by the Atlantic Council in a report they issued back on April 12th that we have to get rid of the Outer Space Treaty and have a whole brand new treaty. That's a question. Will the current administration actually take that approach? I mean, I have my opinions on it, obviously, but that's a big question we have right now, given we're just a little more than 100 days into this new administration.
I can't help but ask the follow-on question that people will inevitably want to understand is, what are your opinions on the Outer Space Treaty and refining or reproducing a new Outer Space Treaty?
Well, I mean, just going back to the report. I mean, it was a very interesting report, and they highlighted a lot of interesting concerns, and you know that basically has to do with how fast space is developing. But I think their approach is wrong, because specifically they said, one, I mean, you know, basically conventions like the Liability Convention, the Rescue Agreement, and such. Some of these other conventions that are out there, they said we need to amend them, and we have, and we hope further as far as the Outer Space Treaty, we need just to amend, basically supplant that wholesale. In other words, whole new treaty, get rid of the Outer Space Treaty. That's easier said than done for two reasons. One, even though there's provision within all these treaties for amendment, it's really it's a political heavy lift. I mean, it's very hard to politically get people to decide to change this document. Is it worthwhile? In the case of the Outer Space Treaty, I mean, I constantly hear people saying, well, we should amend the Outer Space Treaty. And it's like, easier said than done. Is there a political will to actually do this? And bottom line is this, just to sideline this a little bit, all this really, all this idea, of international law and legalities and such is good, but the decisions are made at the policy level, at the political level. They have to be a political decision to, take these legal steps, or to take steps that would create these new ideas and these new rules. So do I think it's a good idea? No, I don't think it's a good idea. And specifically with in regards to the Outer Space Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated during the time of the Cold War. And for all intents and purposes, it was the two prime political forces behind it was the Soviet Union and the United States. We had our differences. We were both getting out into space. We were the major players at the time, and we had most of the say at the time. And even then, it took many years to actually pound out that treaty to get what we have today. If we were to approach the treaty a new treaty at this point, we'd have a multiplicity of new players in outer space who would obviously have to be part of the process. So you're going to have multiple cooks trying to create something new, and it would be very hard to compromise and uphold basically your national interests. And when you get right down to it, this is all about treaties. When you do a treaty, it's about preserving your national interests while at the same time getting somebody else to give up an advantage. And people say, well, that's not right. And it's like, well, it's reality. And I compare it to what I do as a lawyer when I negotiate a contract with or any other situation for a client. I'm going to get my client the best deal possible while trying to get the other side to give it up. My job isn't to represent the other client. My job is to represent my client. And if that means getting as much as I can while getting them to actually give up things, that's my job. And the same thing goes with international law and treaties. So treaties are just basically contracts. And the idea is if we can get, basically to get the best deal we can for our national security and our geopolitical interests. Well, with a new treaty, you're going to have a lot of new players in the mix right now who are going to come in who have their own state interests as well, and they're going to want to say, and it's going to make it it's probably going to make it more tenfold difficult. And the question is, will that benefit the U.S. geopolitically in the long run in terms of national security, in terms of commercial space activities, and in terms of civil space activities? So I don't think the treaty route is better. I think our best bet is to continue on with the Artemis Accords, which kind of use what we call customary international law, or law created through actual actions or actual activities, and actually create the law as these situations come up.
Thank you. Now, kind of extending on beyond orbits around Earth and getting to the moon and Mars, I think China has already said that the Mars is theirs. They've claimed Mars for the PRC. Who are we as a nation to say, well, hold on a second, Mars isn't yours? And what happens when the moon starts to, quote unquote, get settled and additional actors start becoming more prevalent in the LEO orbit with their own space stations? So I know I went through a lot there, but could you unpack that, even going from the orbit down to the celestial bodies?
Well, I'm going to unpack this like this and talk about China a little bit and try and put China's space program in perspective. China has thousands and thousands of years. It has a lot of history compared to the U.S. I mean, we're still basically 5-year-olds in terms of our history compared to China. And China at one time was a multiplicity of little kingdoms that were actually brought together by an emperor. And you got to always keep that in mind with China. China is very rooted in their history and in their culture, and their space program as well is basically emulates their history and their culture. And they use that history and their culture to justify claims. Well, for example, what's happening in the South China Sea right now, and I'm sorry, we're going back to the Maritime Law, even though I don't like comparing maritime law to outer space. See what I'm caught into? The South China Sea, basically, they one of their ideas for explicitly violating international law is saying we have a cultural and historical right to these lands. Our history shows that our people were out here before anybody else, and that's how they're using it to justify it. What they're doing with outer space, you notice a lot of their spacecraft, their rovers on the moon, they're all based on basically their culture and their history, their mythology. So they're kind of building a mythological and historical rationale to create a legal right. Back in December, the rover on the moon, I believe it was on the South Pole, launched a sample return rocket back to Earth with some lunar samples on it. And after that, the descent module, which is still on the surface of the moon, raised a Chinese flag. And I really thought when I saw that flag, I was really interested in saying, you know what? I wonder what that means. What is the intention of raising a flag? And let me put this in perspective: what the U.S. how the U.S. views this. Back during when Apollo 12 was on its way to the moon, the Congress was in session and debating the NASA Authorization Act, and they were really concerned about the idea of putting a flag on the moon. What Buzz and Neil both did when Apollo 11 landed, because that wasn't originally part of the mission plan. It was kind of an afterthought. Hey, we're going to the moon. Maybe we should put a flag. Now, historically, during the discovery phase, during discovery era, European discovery area, when you put a flag someplace, you were basically claiming sovereign territory. Congress was worried that by placing a flag on the moon, we were basically saying, it's ours. And we had this conundrum because we signed this thing called the Outer Space Treaty just a couple of years before. And the whole idea behind the Outer Space Treaty is outer space, including the moon and the celestial bodies, don't belong to anybody. They're basically what we call the province of all mankind. And there's a lot of debate about what that means too, which we won't get into in this short interview. But so fundamentally, what Congress said, we're going to make it part of this. We're going to make it part of federal law that the implanting of the American flag on the moon or other celestial bodies is a symbol of nationalism and national pride and achievement. It doesn't mean it's a sovereign claim. So specifically, when we went to the moon with all the Apollo missions to plant that flag, we're just saying, yeah, we did it. This is our technical achievement, and we're proud of it, and we're kind of commemorating it with this American flag. The question is, what does China's flag mean when it raises that flag on that descent module? Is it about national pride and achievement, or is it a sovereign, or is it kind of the precursor to a sovereign claim? And I say that because, again, going back to the maritime domain in the South China Sea, they've raised their national flag as a sign of sovereignty, as a sign of territorial claim. So China didn't come right out and say we're claiming the moon with this, but I think they kind of, in a sense, they've sent a message that this could actually, we're setting a legal precedent or a means of actually in the future making sovereign claims, maybe not of the whole moon, but of little parts of our territory, little parts of the moon itself, which could grow and grow and grow. Some people will say, well, it's being paranoid. I'm saying it's being realistic because, considering the activities that are happening here on Earth versus, you've got to kind of compare them to what they're doing in outer space. And again, I know I said I don't like comparing Earth to outer space when it comes to space law, but unfortunately, I'm doing it many times during this interview. But so again, and I kind of put that question out to social media, and I got a lot of interesting feedback. I have my opinions about what that flag means or what it might mean in the future, but I just thought it was very interesting. So what they do on the moon, what they do in outer space, and what they will do when they eventually get to Mars as well, when they actually they're going to be landing a rover on Mars in maybe this month or next month. They're going to drop a rover from their orbiting spacecraft. So the question is, if that rover raises a flag, what does that mean? Is it a sovereign claim? Is it just a symbol of technological achievement and national pride? Good questions to ask and something to be wary of. So that's kind of, and again, it's something we could talk about probably in hours on end, but that's kind of a rough idea of my view of China activities in outer space.
Thank you. And I know how busy you are, so I really do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to SFA today. I am curious about the new agreement that was signed by the PRC and Russia about their creating their own international space station there. What's the impact then to our current endeavors in outer space and potential impact to our national security?
Was it the space station or the moon base or the moon research station on the moon that they signed the they did, and this caught a lot of headlines. And with when it comes to China and Russia, I don't try and have knee-jerk reactions about it, saying, "Oh my God, this is the end of the world." They're taking things over. It's a good step. It's good to step back and say, "Okay, what does this mean? Is this really as bad as we think everybody says it is?" And we got to really we got to always think things through and keep a clear head when we're talking about this. My opinions. Well, there's this concept called the three warfares that basically was created by the Chinese government and the philosophy of war. And China basically looks at everything as war, and whether it's legal, political, or psychological. So they basically designed this concept of the three warfares, where legal warfare, political warfare, psychological warfare. In other words, using media and other outlets, social media, what have you. And you can kind of break that. You can break from those three. You can break down different areas. So I kind of analyzed that announcement from the aspect of the three warfares. And basically, the way I looked at it was, one, this MOU could basically be setting the groundwork for potential manipulation of international law as far as claiming territory on the moon. Politically, this is something that they can basically bark out to the world that, oh, look, we're smiling for the cameras, we're friends, we're cooperating in space. Why isn't the U.S. cooperating with us? To kind of give the U.S. and its allies a black eye over not quote cooperating with them in outer space. And from a psychological perspective, well, I looked at the psychological perspective on social media and some of the articles that came out. People were just oh my God, this is the end of the world. We got to have some knee-jerk reaction or knee-jerk responses to actually, respond to this. How do we respond to this? So you got to step back and look at it from those perspectives, what they're really doing. Now, I always say one thing with the Dragon Bear is they smile for they shake hands and smile for the cameras, but they're always sizing each other up. They are natural enemies, and at some point they are going to turn on each other. So this whole idea of Dragon Bear cooperation, or China and Russia cooperating, is something to watch. It's something to be concerned about, especially in outer space and in all the domains for that matter. But always with the caveat that they are natural enemies, and at some point they are going to turn on each other.
Are we going to have U.S. astronauts on the PRC space station?
No, and that's. And basically, I think a lot of this is tit for tat, just because the idea that China isn't allowed on the International Space Station. However, China has been doing a very aggressive soft power, a political move in the United Nations, where it's basically opening up the space station for private companies and other nations to come onto the space station and perform experiments. But here's the caveat: bottom line is, you got to remember, China likes intellectual property. You got to read the fine print about any intellectual property you develop on that, and who owns any of the results of the experiments. But here's something interesting that I just actually learned over the weekend is. The Russians said, I'm making this big thing how they're going to cooperate with they want to participate in the Chinese space station. However, from the Chinese space station, the angle it's basically set in orbit. And I'm not an orbital mechanics guy, so I'm definitely not even going to try to explain it. But from what I understand, it's a very high inclination to the point where the Russians can't reach it from their territory. In other words, their launch facilities. What does that translate into? You got to use Chinese launch facilities and spacecraft. Now, apparently, the Russians did go ask ask Chinese about this and ask them to lower the inclinations, but they refused. So the idea of cooperation is nice, but really, are you cooperating when you're basically setting up a point where you have the monopoly on the launch to get there? And the same thing with the U.S. Basically, the orbital inclination, it really is impractical for the U.S. to try and reach a spacecraft from there. So you got to take these ideas of cooperation and with a big grain of salt in terms of the larger geopolitical atmosphere. There's all those talk about worldwide cooperation. At its fundamental, nations have their own interests, and they're going to pursue those interests, and that's geopolitics, and that's reality. And that may not sound like something we want to hear, but it's something I tell people: look, you just got to open your eyes and see what's happening, and understand this is reality, and approach it appropriately.
Yes, it's a good point. This is the new reality. Nation states access to space is going to become more and more prevalent, and until we set up those norms of behavior, there's going to be a lot of questions, probably a lot more questions than answers at this point, until we start actually doing the activities, as you say, to where we get get those norms identified. Sir, any closing comment? Go ahead.
And I'm gonna close with what and just to respond to what you just said. The idea of creating norms of behavior and standards of behavior is great, but you got to be careful because they can become a trap as well. I mentioned this thing called lawfare or legal warfare earlier on, and the idea is if your philosophy is, I'm going to get my adversary to agree to these rules that I know because of their nature and their standing in the world they're going to obey. If I can get them to do that, I'm in a good position where during a conflict, if I have a strategic advantage to ignore them, I can do it, and I can trap them in their own rules. I think a really good idea. I've seen this. People say, "Well, this isn't real." The People's Liberation Army, that's part of their doctrine. Basically, if we can get an advantage by ignoring the law, ignore the law. And a lot of this is going to come down, I think, with the idea of ASATs. There's a lot of talk. Well, the China or Russia would never do this because it would pollute orbit with space debris. The idea, people have to understand. We think, Westerners think differently than the Chinese or the Russians. It's a cultural thing, and you can't the idea is, that you can't just depend on the idea that they're going to be, quote, responsible players if there's a strategic advantage. In other words, if they could prevent a larger conflict by disabling satellites over, the areas like the Pacific or the South China Sea, they might actually do it and put us in a bad position. So there was an admiral who I listened to during a conference. Can't remember his name, but I know he's with the space, I believe with the Space Force or Space Command. Very interesting, very, very alert fellow in the fact that he understands that the way the Chinese think about space, nuclear weapons, or other domains isn't the same that we do. And we got to learn how they think so we can basically adapt our strategies, whether it's, in terms of outer space, deterrence, national security, what have you, appropriately.
Michael, I'm going to let you go here soon, but one more question, only because I think it's really
Sure.
pertinent, and it's been coming up a lot lately. Sandra Irwin over at Space News had a question about the privatization of our national security space mission or aspects of it. Mm-hmm. What's the impact if the Space Force chooses to, and U.S. Spacecom says, hey, we're going to privatize some of the capability, not all of the capability? What's the implication there?
Well, I'll just start with a statement. I think it's a bad idea. This doesn't make me comfortable in the sense that we're going to make national security a service versus an actual government function, and that's essentially what it sounds like they're talking in some respects. However, if you one of the drawbacks to this is if you start making commercial companies responsible for national security, they become legitimate targets in a conflict. If, for example, if tensions were high, say, I'm going to use South China Sea again because it's a real hotspot right now. If tensions were rising and it looked like there might be an open conflict, the PRC might decide, you know what, we're going to start disabling some satellites that are geared towards national security. That might be photo reconnaissance. That might be GPS. Oh, I have the civilian satellite that's hosting a payload that serves an important national security mission. You know what, we're going to target that too as well. So the idea of putting national security assets on a civilian satellite increases the chance that it's become a legitimate target during a time of war. I don't think it's a good idea. So, I mean, I haven't really studied enough or thought about it enough, but my first impression is bad idea. Don't do it.
Okay, thank you for that. And I can't help but then the one, which you talked about, the Outer Space Treaty with the no nuclear weapons in space. How do you define a nuclear weapon versus a nuclear propulsion system?
Well, it's different. Basically, a nuclear weapon is a weapon of mass destruction, something that can go boom and make and cause a lot of havoc. That's a no-no, and I mean that's been flirted with a little bit. I mean, during the Khrushchev era, he basically boasted about these things called fractional orbital bombardment, where basically you would shoot a warhead into well, I'm not going to say space because there's some legal connotations to that, but shoot it up where it almost goes into a partial orbit, and just before it completes a full orbit, it drops down on a target. Well, in response to that, we developed a system called an ASAT system, actually the world's first anti-satellite system, called Program 437, which took a Thor rocket and put a nuclear warhead on it. The idea is it would go up and intercept these, what we call FOBs. Eventually, though, we decided, our nuclear warhead idea, ASAT, isn't a good idea because it violates the Outer Space Treaty. And I think during a later SALT treaty, we basically, told the Russians, the Soviets, we know these basically, are a treaty violation, not good. So stuff like, so basically anything that involves the operation of a nuclear weapon is per se prohibited. Let me give another example. During SDI, the Reagan administration liked the idea of X-ray lasers that would basically be launched from the surface. They would have a nuclear weapon on board. The nuclear weapon would detonate before it reached orbit and focus a fraction of the energy into laser beams that would destroy incoming missiles during their cruise phase. Well, the big problem with that is, and I recall an Air Force JAG actually wrote about this, is that it was it would be the operation of a nuclear weapon and violate the Outer Space Treaty. Good point. So a nuclear propulsion system, on the other hand, is something you're going to go up. It's not really an explosion as much as a device heats gases to create propellant, and that would send you to send a spacecraft off. So my basic kind of formula for that: if it doesn't go boom, it's probably not prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty.
Got it. Thank you so much, because I suspect there's a lot of discussions about the quicker way to get to Mars. Nuclear propulsion. It just makes sense.
Well, and basically the Trump administration laid the foundation for nuclear propulsion. I think DARPA just awarded 3 companies contracts to develop a concept for a nuclear engine as well. So we're hopefully well on our way to developing nuclear engine to help open up the solar system a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wonder if the civilian or commercial sector will be able to get access to that material to create all their own propulsion.
Actually, there was another. I think it was a space policy directive or an executive order during the Trump administration that basically opened the door for possibility for commercial companies to actually gain access to nuclear materials for nuclear reactors to power systems and for nuclear propulsion as well. Very controversial because of, you're giving people access to fissile material that could be proliferated. But still, it was a huge step forward, and I hope we keep moving in that direction.
Thank you so much. I tell you, sir, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Michael J. Listner, founder and principal at Space Law and Policy Solutions. Sir, any closing comments or questions or comments from you?
just the fact that, just the closing comment that we're just basically on the cusp of what, space law and policy is going to open up, where it's really in its infancy. I mean, I'm very, very happy to be, in a position where I can actually think about this and think about new ideas. And the whole idea with the commercial space and opening up the solar system and space resources, I think we're in store for a really bright future moving forward, and expanding our presence through the solar system and developing outer space, and looking up and saying, when we look up at the sky, saying, wow, this is a wondrous view, but also knowing that people are out there actually doing activities and developing the solar system.
Great, thank you, sir. And if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I do have a website, www.spacelawsolutions.com, and I also have a space law and policy briefing letter, which you can find in my information about at my website as well. I publish it quarterly with sometimes special issues in between. It's been pretty popular, and if you're interested, just go to my website, and if you go to that specific page, I have a link, and if you send me a link, I'll send you a free copy to look at.
Perfect. Thanks again for your time, and we'll talk real soon. I think we'd like to probably get regular updates from you as the space law discussion continues to evolve.
Absolutely, Bill. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. We'll talk soon.